An independent editorial defense analysis focused on Australia's strategic environment.
The recent unveiling of a left-hand drive variant of the Bushmaster Protected Mobility Vehicle at the Thales Australia facility in Bendigo represents a significant, albeit delayed, pivot in the strategic calculus of the Australian defense industry. For over 2 decades, the Bushmaster has existed as a uniquely Australian solution to a universal problem. It was designed specifically for the distinct operational requirements and traffic regulations of a nation that drives on the left. While the platform has achieved iconic status within the Australian Defence Force and garnered respect through deployments in Afghanistan and more recently Ukraine, its export potential has historically been constrained by this fundamental design rigidity. The decision to reconfigure the driver interface for the majority of the global market is not merely a technical modification. It is a critical industrial maneuver intended to bridge the gap between a domestic capability and a sustainable global export product. This shift must be viewed through the lens of industrial continuity rather than simple commercial expansion. The Bendigo production line faces a looming precipice as domestic orders under the Land 121 program near completion. A specialized defense manufacturing base requires a minimum throughput to retain skilled labor and tooling certifications, often estimated in this sector at between 50 and 100 units annually. Without a steady stream of orders, the cost of keeping the facility dormant or operating at minimum capacity becomes a burden on the Commonwealth. This could manifest either through direct subsidies or inflated costs for future domestic procurements. The introduction of the left-hand drive variant suggests a recognition that the domestic market is likely insufficient to sustain a sovereign industrial capability in the long term. By aligning the platform with the regulatory and operational norms of Europe and North America, the manufacturer is attempting to decouple the survival of the production line from the cyclical procurement schedule of the Australian Army. From an operational standpoint, the configuration of the driver's compartment is a non-trivial factor in combat effectiveness. While Ukrainian forces have utilized the Australian donation of standard right-hand drive Bushmasters with considerable success, the cognitive load placed on drivers operating a vehicle on the opposite side of the cabin to their training cannot be discounted. In high-stress environments where reaction times are measured in milliseconds, the instinctive glance to a mirror or the spatial awareness of the vehicle's corners is critical. The adaptation to a left-hand drive configuration removes this friction. It transforms the Bushmaster from a specialized donation into a viable candidate for standardized procurement by NATO member states. This is particularly relevant as Eastern European nations accelerate the divestment of Soviet-era BTR and BMP fleets, seeking Western platforms that offer higher survivability without the logistical footprint of a main battle tank. The competitive landscape into which this new variant enters is, however, so crowded and complex. The Bushmaster occupies a specific niche between light utility vehicles and heavy armored personnel carriers. It is competing against established European platforms, such as the Finnish Patria 6x6 and the French Serval, as well as the ubiquitous American Joint Light Tactical Vehicle. The American platform, while offering high mobility, lacks the 10-person squad capacity of the Bushmaster. This distinction places the Australian vehicle in a favorable position for roles requiring the movement of full infantry sections, rather than just reconnaissance teams. The challenge lies in the logistics of distance. Shipping a 15-ton vehicle from Victoria to the European theater introduces a cost and time penalty that local manufacturers do not face. This geographic reality implies that any significant export success may eventually necessitate a distributed manufacturing model. In such a scenario, Australian intellectual property might be licensed for assembly in the customer's region, a trade-off that secures revenue but potentially dilutes the direct labor benefits for the Bendigo workforce. Financial viability remains a central component of this analysis. With an estimated unit cost between 2.2 and 2.5 million Australian dollars, the Bushmaster presents a value proposition that balances cost against survivability. Its V-hull monocoque design provides protection levels compliant with high STANAG standards, a feature that has been validated by the survival of crews in active conflict zones. This combat provenance is a marketing asset that few competitors can claim to the same degree. However, the European procurement cycle is notoriously slow and politically driven. It often prioritizes continental industrial cooperation over pure capability assessment. The entry of an Australian product into this market tests the depth of the defense relationships Canberra has cultivated with partners in the Euro-Atlantic sphere. It raises the question of whether the strategic goodwill generated by Australia's support for Ukraine can be converted into tangible defense contracts. There is also a doctrinal dimension to this development. The Australian Defence Force has long tailored its equipment to its specific strategic geography, often resulting in orphan capabilities that are difficult to integrate with allies or sustain without exorbitant costs. The move to a standardized left-hand drive export model suggests a potential shift towards designing for the global market first and adapting for Australian use second, or at least concurrently. This approach would align Australia more closely with the industrial strategies of nations like South Korea, where exportability is a primary design requirement from the outset. Such a strategy allows for larger production runs, driving down the per-unit cost for the domestic military, and ensuring that parts and maintenance knowledge are widely available within Allied supply chains. The timing of this development highlights a critical tension in Australian defence policy between the desire for self-reliance and the necessity of global integration. A sovereign defence industry is frequently cited as a national security priority. Yet the domestic budget is rarely sufficient to support continuous production of major land systems. The Bushmaster LHD program serves as a case study in attempting to resolve this tension. It demonstrates that sustaining a local capability often requires adhering to international standards, rather than insisting on unique local specifications. If the Bendigo facility can secure orders from European nations looking to recapitalize their protected mobility fleets, it would validate the thesis that Australian industry can compete in the high-end land systems market. Conversely, a failure to secure these contracts despite the technical adaptation would expose the harsh limits of trying to act as a global supplier from a geographically isolated position. Ultimately, the technical modification of the steering column represents a broader systemic adaptation. It acknowledges that the future of Australian defence manufacturing cannot rely solely on the Australian taxpayer. The success of this venture will depend not just on the performance of the vehicle, but on the ability of the Australian government and industry to navigate the complex offset requirements, technology transfer agreements, and political alliances that govern the European defence market. The Bushmaster has proven it can survive on the battlefield. The question now is whether the industrial strategy supporting it can survive the rigors of the global market. This transition marks the end of the platform's existence as a purely Australian curiosity, and the beginning of its test as a legitimate international commodity.